All right. Hey, everybody. So, clearly today, I'm going to be talking about how language, how words, how our vocabulary changes the way we think. So, I want to start off with this activity. And I want you guys to count the number of pigs on the slide. All right. So, there's 22 pigs, right? All right. Well, I hope you guys counted 22 pigs. And my guess is that the way you guys counted these was in your head, you went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. But what if you lived in a language that didn't have words for numbers? So, in the Amazon, there's a tribe called the Piraha. And the Piraha tribe don't have words for numbers like we do. Instead, they have one word, hoi, meaning smaller or lesser, or maybe even one. And then they have another word, hoi, meaning larger or more or bigger. So, for example, if we had two small fish, we might use the first word, hoi. And if we had one larger fish, we might call that hoi. So how do you guys think that someone of the Piraha tribe might count these pigs? Can anybody tell me? All the way in the back. Hey, Jack. Yeah, exactly. So they might use the word hoi, meaning larger or more. So we come to see that this is really an accurate system, especially as a quantity grows. And researchers have actually gone into this community and they've studied them, talked to them, and figured out that the Piraha people have a fundamentally different understanding of numbers than we do. What they have, we wouldn't call a concept of numbers. So they can't calculate exact numbers above 1. So if someone from the Piraha tribe wanted to talk to a friend and said, hey, could you give me 2 apples? They literally could not do so because they do not have the vocabulary. So these are the Piraha people. And we usually think of numbers as being kind of a counterpoint to words, because in math, we typically write in symbols, right? We don't write out the word 7 plus 7 equals 14. We use symbol language. But this is just in writing, right? Because when we actually think, don't we need words in order to visually conceptualize this idea of numbers? I mean, can you imagine trying to count these pigs without words? It's hard to figure out, right, in your head. So, what I want to talk about now is what scholars think. So, the kind of theories behind language and how it affects how we think, and some studies as well. So, it is quite an illusion to imagine that one adjusts to reality essentially without the use of language, and that language is merely an incidental means of solving specific problems of communication or reflection. And this is said by Edward Sapir, a Prussian-American psycholinguist in 1958. And so what he's saying here is that language is not just a tool to express ourselves, but actually defines how we think. So Edward Sapir and Benjamin Whorf came up with this hypothesis called linguistic relativity. And basically it says what the quote just expressed, that language changes and shapes the way we think. There's a strong version of this, which says that all our thoughts and actions are restricted by language. So if we can't think it in words, we literally can't think it at all. But there's also a weak version, which is generally agreed upon in the psycholinguist community, that language only somewhat shapes our thinking and behavior. And then on the opposite side of the spectrum, there's universalism. So universalism as a concept is a religious and philosophical concept that we usually associate with religion. And basically it means that some ideas are universally applicable. But when we apply this to language, what universalism means is that some part of humans, some innate biological part of us, is shared no matter what language we speak. So that when we create languages, all languages share core qualities. So we can kind of see how nature and nurture play out in universalism versus the fear-warp hypothesis. Universalism says that our nature, our innate core determines language, while the fear-warp hypothesis says that our different languages can actually change us as we grow up. So the strongest support for universalism probably comes from the study of color and how humans study and name color. So in the 1960s, Paul Kay and Brent Berlin decided to talk to people who spoke different languages and see exactly how they named color. So for example, in English, we would refer to a specific spectrum of color as red, and another spectrum of color as orange. But in another language, they might call these the same color. And what he found was actually very surprising. He found that across languages, we share similar names for similar spectrums of color. So if a society had only 2 words for color, the words that they would have would be white and black, words that referred to white spectrum and to a darker spectrum. And if we had a 3rd color, we'd add yellow, red, and then yellow, and then green, blue, brown, and everything else. So there must be something about us biologically, because think about all these different societies that grow up in isolation around the world, right? There must be something about us biologically that shapes how we perceive color and how we name color. Next, I want to talk about orientation. So I'm going to go back to this pig slide, and I want to ask you guys to recall how you counted these pigs. Like, which pigs did you count first? Did you count from which direction to which direction? Can anybody tell me how they counted these pigs? Top to bottom and left to right. Okay, so in English, it's pretty clear that we read and we write from left to right. So it makes sense that we might think this way, even when we're counting something that's not normally associated with language. But what's interesting is that if you asked a Hebrew speaker how to count these pigs, it's very likely that they would count from right to left, because that's how the Hebrew language is structured. And what's even more interesting to me is that the Australian Aboriginals in the town of Pomperau, how they might count these pigs. So, us in the English language, we talk about direction with relative reference frames, meaning I would say this carpet is in front of me, or it's to my right, whereas someone from Pomperau might say instead, this carpet is to my southeast, or hey, could you move that carpet to the northwest a little bit? So the way they would count those pigs is from east to west, no matter which direction they were facing or which way I was presenting this presentation. So what we see from this is that they're always aware of where they are, of where north, east, south, and west are, because their language forces them to refer to things this way, unlike us. And the Australian Aboriginals, when researchers have found that they have better spatial awareness, better navigational ability than us. And what might be surprising is that 1/3 of the world's languages actually use absolute reference frames, refer to cardinal directions, right, like a compass. So this becomes pretty relevant. Next, I want to look at this sentence, an English sentence, Madison broke the vase. My friend Madison right there who inspired this. So in Turkish, how you would speak this sentence, I'm going to look at it in different languages, different lenses. In Turkish, your verb would have to depend on whether or not you were there to watch the vase break, whether you saw it firsthand, or whether or not maybe Madison told you later, or you heard it secondhand. So you would use a different verb in each of those situations. And we can kind of see that built into this language is information about the reliability of what you just heard. And in Spanish, what's interesting is that there's another likely way you might phrase a sentence. So depending on whether or not Madison broke the vase intentionally, if she did it by accident, let's say she just knocked it over walking by a table, then you might say the vase was broken, something we wouldn't say normally in English language. So we can see that the idea of blame kind of comes up here too. If when it was unintentional, we talk about it differently with different language, Does that change how we see the perpetrator and the crime or the accident? So Lara Boroditsky, who is a modern psycholinguist, actually has looked into this and taken studies from people who only spoke Spanish, native Spanish speakers, and people who only spoke English, native English speakers. And she asked them both to recall events or specifics about videos that she showed them of someone doing the same thing, but accidentally or intentionally. And what they found was that even though these speakers had the same recall rate for perpetrators who did things, let's say broke the pencil or broke the vase intentionally, for accidents, American speakers or English speakers were more likely to be able to recall. And there have been more studies to show that when we use certain language that has a subject defines someone as doing something, we tend to place more blame on that person when the action is bad. And the Biraha people that I talked about in my introduction, they might not say something similar at all because they don't actually have a past tense nor a future tense. So when we look at the Biraha people, the question of their culture actually comes up because their culture states that we should live in the moment. It's embedded into every moment of their lives about how we don't look into the past and we don't look into the future, we focus on the present. And then another question emerges on whether or not their culture shaped their language, or whether or not perhaps their language shaped their culture. Now I want to look at, so you guys know how different languages have nouns that can be feminine or masculine, like in Spanish, like in French, German, Russian, lots of languages around the world. And if we look at this word bridge, the German equivalent is a feminine noun, and the Spanish equivalent is a masculine noun. So researchers have taken German speakers and Spanish speakers who both spoke English and asked them to describe the word bridge in English terms. And what they found was surprising, that depending on the masculinity or femininity of that noun in your native language, you would describe it differently. So in German, you might use words like beautiful or peaceful. And in Spanish, you might use words like strong or towering. So we can see how the ideas of femininity and masculinity can play even into seemingly neutral nouns. If you look at the word key, we can switch it around. It's masculine in German, it's feminine in Spanish. But the German people use words like fragile and peaceful to describe a key, while Spanish speakers tended to use words more like dangerous or intricate, little, lovely. Yeah, you guys can read, so. So what we see is that even in everyday nouns, like think about how every noun in these languages is defined by masculinity or femininity. We can see how it might start to shape how we view the world. So in art, we see how this plays an overwhelming role in how artists who speak these languages that define nouns and masculinity or femininity paint or describe abstract nouns like death, sin, or time. And what they found was that 85% of the time, these artists defined their gender based on what gender it was with their language. So whether or not it was el or la in Spanish, that would define 85% of the time what gender they used to describe or paint this figure, this abstract, like father time and so on. So I now want to talk about a little bit more into the implications. So why does this matter, the impact of language on how we think? So pretty clear is how translation might play a big part, right? If I speak English and somebody I'm talking to speaks Spanish, if I say something and somebody translates what I say to them, am I saying what they think I'm saying? Is our conversation equal on both sides? If we look at literature, so The Vegetarian by Han Kang, which was translated into English by Deborah Smith, it was originally a Korean novel. It actually recently won in 2016 the Man Booker International Prize. It was the first Korean novel to win this prize. But when it did, there was actually a spark of outrage in the Korean community because they thought that Deborah Smith's translation was inaccurate. That by translating it into English, she had added embellishment, she had added more activity on the part of the characters. Because in Korean novels, the characters tend to be more passive to things that happen to them, instead of how in Western novels we might expect these characters to drive the plot forward more often. But because this question of why Korean literature is like this, it actually stems from a long culture of being oppressed by outside nations. So the fact that it won on language that was more active than passive, that was in a way more Western than Korean, asked the question on whether or not Han Kang's book won this prize, or whether or not Deborah Smith created something new that was then praised. We can also look at cognitive therapy. So cognitive therapy is a very common treatment for people who are dealing with serious psychological problems like bipolar disorder or like a fear of something. And what they found is that negative thoughts, by using negative language in our heads, we can come up with negative emotions or negative behavior. And if we change our thoughts, into positive language like, I love myself, or I know I can do this, I know I can do this, then we start to see that we start to feel better and start to act better, or that's the idea anyway. So this has been used broadly across psychiatry for problems like depression, like addiction, like anxiety, and so on. Now, politics. Language plays a huge deal in politics. Political language, and with variations, this is true of all political parties, from conservatives to anarchists, is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. So, this is actually said by George Orwell, who a lot of you guys I'm sure might know, because he wrote the book 1984. I know a lot of you guys have probably been studying this in AP language and composition, but I wanted to look at a little bit a different side of George Orwell and what else he has said about language and politics. So George Orwell actually believed that politicians drove the degradation of the English language. I'm going to say something that a politician once said, and I want you guys to see if you can make any sense out of it. I am not, indeed, sure whether it is not true to say that the Milton who once seemed not unlike a 17th century Shelley had not become, out of an experience ever more bitter in each year, more alien to the founder of that Jesuit sect which nothing could induce him to tolerate. So I don't know about you guys, but what he just said means absolutely nothing to me. I mean, I read that like 10 times, and I could not make any sense out of it. So what Orwell believed is that politicians, scholars, they started to use more dead metaphors, more pretentious language that didn't really mean anything in his time. And he came up with this idea that by cleaning up our language, we can begin to think more clearly, and we can begin to identify when politicians aren't saying things that really mean anything. He thought that politicians often used euphemisms like, for example, the elimination of unreliable elements. What does that mean? I mean, I've heard that once or twice, and I didn't really think too much about it. But when you dig a little deeper, politicians often use this term to defend things like sending troops to faraway countries where they might die, or by even dropping like the nuclear bomb. So Orwell argued that politicians use euphemisms and inflated language that was truly meaningless to defend the indefensible, to make it sound better than it really was. He came up with a bunch of rules, actually, to figure a way how to clean up our language again, how to make us more clear when we spoke, how to make us understand more clearly. I'm not going to read all these out to you, but for example, he said, never use a long word where a short one will do, or never use the passive where you can use the active. So, what I really want to say in this presentation is that even though we don't think about language a lot, about how we might use it to count numbers, or about how language affects our emotions, it plays a fundamental part in our identities, both as humans and as individuals. So, these days, even though we might not think that learning a new language is particularly relevant, because English is really prevalent these days, it's worldwide considered one of the primary languages. But consider this. If language fundamentally changes how we see the world, maybe learning a new one would help us open up a new set of eyes. Thank you.